what was I going to say? Oh, there's also the one in Australia, and they actually made a movie on this. And I'm trying to out of the Black Rock National Park, and you mentioned it in the book, but you didn't get too much information. And I think you said you tried to dig up information and couldn't find any.
It was thin. It was hard to come by, but I mean, people need to look at that area and understand. When you talk about boulder fields, it's like the boulder field of all boulder fields.
Yeah, and it's and I can't remember the name of the movie. A listener had actually recommended it to me, and they told a strange tale, but it's hard to say, how much of it was actually based on information they found and how much was just based on hearsay and legend.
Right.
But
and that's the part we've tried to stay true to, is not trying to work outside the box, but stay within a real confined box of facts and evidence. And it's all right to bring in, fairy tales, myths, legends, because sometimes they help understand that this may be happening in other parts of the world, and there may be a parallel.
Yeah, and it also suggests how far back these tales might actually go.
Absolutely.
And I heard on one show you were talking about an experience you had while hunting where everything got eerily quiet.
Yeah, and every once in a while you hear about this from witnesses, and it's an unexplained phenomena that it's never happened to me before or since, but I was with another friend of mine, and I guess you would say we were bear hunting up in Northern California, even though we've never shot anything. It was more just like a buddy thing to go out. And we were walking along, and I was with this guy who was probably 68, 70 years old, but in phenomenal shape. A real man who knows the woods upside down and sideways and just knows life well. And as we're walking along, all of a sudden, simultaneously, we stopped and turned towards each other and said, "You realize what's going on?" And we looked around, and it was like a complete vacuum of silence. There was no sound. There was no movement. And we looked up to the top of this Douglas fir tree, probably 400 feet, and you could see it swaying, but you couldn't hear any sound. And I said, "Okay, you go to this side of the tree, and you look that way. I'm going to go to this side and look this way, and let's see how long it takes for it to come back." It was several minutes later, all of a sudden the chipmunks come back, the wind comes back, the normal sounds associated with the forest come back. I can tell you that it was a very, very weird feeling that we both had together at the same time.
And I've had that experience in the woods, and it is definitely a very creepy. It almost reminds me of what Jenny Randall's called the Oz factor.
Explain that for me and the viewers.
Which is when people have UFO experiences, they seem to happen in sort of a altered state of consciousness, or even paranormal experiences where things seem different and things get dead quiet, and it just takes on almost a surreal feel.
And I think that's true for us, because there was some other element there besides just no noise that made us turn around together and recognize it. It was like a sixth sense that we don't regularly understand.
Yeah, something you couldn't necessarily detect, but you were kind of just feeling slightly.
Yep.
And it could just be areas of the earth, like boulder fields and stuff, may also set off like altered state of consciousness.
I would say that, but there's something to these big granite areas, and as I've said in the books, that the biggest cluster anywhere in the world that we can identify right now is Yosemite, and there is the biggest mass of granite probably anywhere around that people visit on a regular basis. And then when you think of stories like on Mount Shasta, where a guy named Carl Landers was climbing the mountain with his friends, went around a corner and disappeared where there's no place to disappear to, and never found, none of his equipment's ever found. I remember the state search and rescue coordinator said to me, "Dave, he either went in or he went up, but he's not on."
Wow. One of the other things I found interesting is so many of these people are found, in whatever state they're found, they're often found near naked or completely naked, but there's never really any sexual abuse or molestation going on.
No. And another unusual part of that is that as people, sometimes thousands of searchers are looking for this person, I would say 95% of the time, that clothing is never found. And usually, sometimes they find gloves of search and rescue people, other things that are missing from search and rescue people, but this clothing is never found. What you're going to hear from a lot of people who haven't read the book and are just armchair theorists is that this is something having to do with hypothermia and its condition where people strip their clothes. The problem with that theory is that in many of these cases, the people strip their clothes within that first couple of hours, and hypothermia couldn't even have set in yet. Or, as in a couple of these cases, the parent said, my child can't dress or undress themselves. So how they got undressed or how they got their clothes back on backwards, I have no idea.
One of the ones that I found especially strange, and someone who actually had some memory of where she had been, was Linda Arteaga? Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know how you pronounce it. Maybe Arteaga?
Something like that. And she was in Arkansas.
Right. That's one of the more current cases as well. And that was in July of 2012, 53 years old, St. Joe, Arkansas. Before I go a lot further, I will say that Arkansas is one of those states that has some of the strangest disappearances and strangest facts associated with the disappearances of any state in the Union. And Linda qualifies in there. She was with her brother. She came out to visit. They were a mile from Buffalo River National Park, and they decided to look for this fishing hole that her brother knew about. Somehow, and this is what happens, somehow they got separated. She doesn't know how, her brother don't know how, but they searched for her for 5 days. They finally ended up finding her, and they take her to the hospital. And she tells a story that as she was missing, there were people watching her in the bushes. And she would try to talk to them, and they wouldn't respond. And she described them as weird people, and they scared her at times. Now, I probably wouldn't have included that story in the book unless there were other stories that mimic that in other parts of the country that involved women as well. And sometimes women have described being chased through the woods by strange guys or strange men. It's always strange or weird. It's not normal looking or normal men.
Right.
In one case, there was a girl that was hanging clothes in her backyard, and she lived way out in the middle of nowhere. And some strange man started chasing her, and she said that she blacked out. She doesn't remember anything else. She remembers waking up next to a lake. Helicopter found her, brought her home. She goes, that's all I remember.
And even that, I mean, could it be that these people are having, like what some people think UFO abduction experiencers have, where they're screen memories, where they're just something that didn't really happen, but they think it happened, and they can't tell the difference?
So one of the things that I think everybody on our team does that many teams of investigators from other criteria don't do is that you hear about cryptozoology researchers, you hear about UFO researchers, you hear about researchers that are maybe paranormal types. Most of these people tend to stay within the confines of their own research area, and they read everything they can about that specific area. Yet we believe from the beginning that this isn't going to be answered by just staying inside the small confines of where we're at. We need to take this wide breadth and really look at all these different things and see what the parallel elements and how they come into play. Now, have you ever read the work of a guy named John Mack?
Yes.
So for the listeners out there, John Mack, PhD out of Harvard. Actually, he was an MD, he's a psychiatrist, a brilliant man, and he started to look into abductions that people claimed were done by aliens, UFOs, and he got into this, and Harvard tried to throw him out of the school, and what he ended up saying was that there seemed to be consistent elements in those stories that aren't publicized, but the people knew, and they would tell the story, and he goes, after hundreds of these, the people couldn't have known what I know, and that's exactly what I apply here to the missing people. There's certain underlying criteria that run through this just like run-through alien abductions, that make these all believable. And there seems to be continuity. Well, when Mack did that, he said, there's certain elements to the abduction that make these highly unusual. And I think that one of those things that he talked about was that somehow or another there's like a memory wash. And when I read that work, I got to say that, that's almost some of the language that was used by investigators on some of these cases involving these people. It's almost like they've lost their memory. It was temporarily suspended. There was a suspension of awareness. There was something that went on with these people, whether it was such a traumatizing event that their brain excluded it, or there was some other thing going on that we don't understand.